I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. First of all, I'd like to begin with acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal people and their ancestors as the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and in future, and recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage. My name's Laurie Brown. I'm Deputy Director at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis. And I'd begin by wishing you all a very warm welcome to today's events, to our Smart Governance Conversations. We're very lucky to have some very important and highly respected speakers. So this is, as I said, as part of IGPA's Smart Governance Conversation for Desirable Australian Futures. So we're looking towards improving our futures. Today we focus on the concept of nudge, or what we might prefer to call in Australia behavioural insights. This is a concept that's taken Australian public policy really by storm, and our job here today is to unpack what it means, thanks to our speakers, and assess the contribution that it can make towards improving public policy within Australia. With this aim in mind, we're delighted, I'm very delighted, to be able to draw on the expertise of one of the world's leading authorities in this area, Professor Gerry Stoker, who's here on my right. Now, Gerry's a Centenary Professor at our institute at the University of Canberra. He's also Chair in Governance at the University of Southampton in the UK. And some of you may know him through his key, most recent books that address issues in a range of areas in public policy, but particularly nudge and behavioural insights. For example, Why Politics Matters. And I was impressed to see the extra titles in terms of nuclear power and energy policy, which is certainly close to our hearts here, the energy policy aspect in Australia. The Limits to Governance. Also, he's well known for being the author of the book on Methods That Matter. And he's also co-author with Peter John of Nudge Nudge, Think Think, published by Bloomsbury Press. Now, I also think if Gerry had rebadged himself as an economist, he may very well be a Nobel Prize laureate, given the recent announcement in terms of economist Professor Richard Thaler and getting awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on nudge. So Gerry, you're my Nobel Prize laureate right here with us tonight. I'm also really delighted to be able to introduce two further experts on behavioural insights who will act, if you like, as discussants in terms of Gerry's presentation. So we've got Associate Professor Nicholas Biddle, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University. Nick is also Deputy Director of the Australian Centre for Applied Social Research Methods. And he's got a long-standing interest in behavioural insights and their use in public policy. So we welcome Nicholas here tonight too. And then right here on my left is Dr. Jack Dan, and Dan works as the National Manager at Telstra, and has responsibilities across strategy and thought leadership, issues around capability development, as well as business relationships and engagement for the government sector. Jack's also leading Telstra's Premier Research and Thought Leadership Program, which I'm sure is quite challenging, and looking at the area of connected government programs, assisting government leaders, particularly to address challenges in policy development, which I guess that's an interest for all of us here tonight. Service delivery, program implementation, it's important to follow policy development right through to implementation and evaluation. Jack also is interested in issues around the process of government to citizen engagement. So hence he's got big interest as well in behavioural insight. So welcome to Jack. So now what I'm going to do is hand over to Gerry, and the format is Gerry's going to give roughly a 30-minute presentation, and then both Nick and Jack will then provide some insights, some reflections of their own, and also on Gerry's presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion amongst the audience. So start thinking about the questions. Now, just very quickly, about to get questions and citizen interaction here. Some of our Institute members were at a meeting today run by Department of Health, and the opening MC, if you like, said, look, we want questions from the audience, and he quoted Ken Henry. And Ken Henry said, there's no stupid question. You're welcome to ask anything. He respects people asking questions no matter what. They'll get addressed. What he doesn't like is people not asking questions. So please listen and get your questions ready for these three people. Gerry.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you very much for everyone making the effort to turn up. You might notice that it's just me. I think in the original advert for this event, it suggested that Peter John might be here. Peter has actually just moved jobs from one London university to another, increasing his commute by at least 2 minutes. And he's taken the opportunity of the gap between the two jobs to wander around various parts of Europe. So the relationship I've had with Peter in terms of research in this area is one that's extended back over 15 years. The book that we wrote that you can see up on the slide there, Nudge, Nudge, Think, Think, I am one of the et als. We had several big hits until Peter decided to go on a solo career, and then we were just left as et als, completely unclear about what to do. Our two main research projects began in 2007, and they were faced with a kind of an attempt to look at the difference between two types of strategies when you're trying to change people's behaviour. The first type of strategy, we use the generic term behaviour change, because at that point the book Nudge had not come out. And the other type of strategy we were looking at was focused much more on the possibility of using collective deliberation in order to change the way that people thought. And shortly after we began our research, which was based on exactly the kind of methodology that then has become very much associated with nudge policy, we were conducting a range of different interventions and then using randomized controlled trials in order to measure their effectiveness or otherwise. Shortly after the publication of the book Nudge in 2008 by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, we started to refer to the first type of interventions which are largely aimed at individuals trying to change largely the information or choice environment that they face in order that they might make choices that are both beneficial to them and beneficial to society. We referred to that strategy as a nudge strategy, and the alternative strategy, the strategy of trying to get people to reflect and consider options over a slightly more extended period, we began to refer to as think. And then some genius, and you are looking at this genius now, had the idea of, well, that would make a great book title. Why don't we call it Nudge, Nudge, Think, Think? And the paper that I'm talking to is a paper that Peter and I have just recently finished, and what I'm going to do is try and present the argument of the paper as best I can. And the gist of it is that nudge is undoubtedly one of the most successful public policy initiatives of the last decade or so. It's spread throughout a whole range of different countries, including Australia, and it's achieved an awful lot of success in terms of its basic objectives. So in that sense, you might argue that, well, why don't we just let it carry on evolving? Why don't we just let it be? But as you'll see, there's a number of criticisms that people have made about the way that nudge policy works and operates, and I think that those criticisms are sufficiently substantial that actually there's a good argument for rethinking or revisiting some of the core arguments around nudge policy. And that's what we do in the paper. And what we suggest instead is that there are different foundations that you could put in place for the development of behavioural change policy in the future, and I'll outline what our thinking is in respect of those. But the hint is that actually perhaps what we need to do is to bring nudge and think a little bit closer together. So, is that enough of an introduction to the basics of nudge policy for most people? Let me give you two examples of classic nudges that hopefully most people will be familiar with. One of the most widely practiced nudges now, I think, in many jurisdictions is an attempt to encourage people to return their tax information quickly or more effectively. And one of the ways in which that's often done is sending a letter to somebody who has not put in a tax return and say to them, you still owe us a tax return, 75% of the businesses in your area have already returned their form, and that we think therefore you would want to get on and do it. And it's a nudge because of the way in which the information is presented. It's presented in a way where there's a peer comparison. You're making a comparison in your head when you receive the letter with information about what others have already done. And one of the insights from behavioural policy is that people quite often like to follow what it is that others have done, and so therefore if you put in a peer comparison, that does appear to have a significant effect in terms of encouraging people to then get on and do something about putting in a tax return. Another widespread nudge, and classically put in place in a range of other locations, is what's called a default nudge, where basically you want people to choose a good option, and in effect what you do is you make that good option the default choice, so that they actually have to actively work not to choose that option. And one of the most common areas where that default has been applied is in the case of getting people who are working to actually be involved in a pension scheme. And in most instances now, pension schemes are the default option, that is, you're automatically enrolled in a pension scheme unless you want to make a lot of effort in order to get out of the pension scheme. And again, the argument is from using behavioural insights that people often want to do the right thing but kind of find it difficult to find the right moment or the right time to do the right thing. But if you make it so that actually doing the wrong thing is harder work and doing the right thing is remarkably easy, then that's actually a good way of intervening in this area. So those are just two examples of the kinds of nudges which are now very familiarly practiced and very much put in place in just not only Australia but also many other jurisdictions. So the first part of the paper really continues this sense of praise for nudge. And I think nudge hardly needs a lot of praise from me. It's received a lot of accolades, and as Laurie mentioned, one of the main instigators and founders of this way of thinking, Richard Thaler, actually won the Nobel Prize for economics this year. I agree with her that it is slightly problematic that there is a Nobel Prize for economics but not for the social sciences more generally. And a very good friend of mine, a Swedish professor, Bo Rothstein, has been having an ongoing fight with the academy to try and persuade them that they should stop giving prizes to economists and start giving prizes to much more deserving social scientists. He's not had a lot of success so far. But if I could just remove that sense of bitterness that came into my voice there, we should move on to say that nudge policy has really proved to be a tremendous success. And I'd want to not only praise the instigators of nudge policy, but also praise the implementers of nudge policy, because I think that it really has proved, in terms of public policy, an extraordinary success. First of all, I think from a social science point of view, it's very attractive policy because it does build up on literally decades of evidence collected about the way that people actually do make decisions and the way that people actually do go about making choices. So in that sense, I think it's very healthy that at last we've got a policy intervention that is built on some very, really strong evidential foundations. Secondly, when people have been trying to implement interventions based on these insights into the way in which people think, they very much committed themselves to a process of trialling and testing. And in many cases, they've actually committed themselves to using randomized controlled trials in order to enable them to have a control group and an intervention group and see whether or not there are different behaviors that emerge from the intervention group. And in that sense, too, I think they're using very sophisticated and very valuable methods to test their policy as they go along. Something which, again, I think we should be celebrating. Thirdly, I think from a policymaker's point of view, many of these interventions do seem to deliver really quite quick wins. Things which are relatively cheap and relatively straightforward to do seem to lead to quite significant improvements in the way that our policy can be put in place. And not only that, I think the different units in different countries, both those that are both part of government and those that are slightly beyond government, have shown enormous energy, commitment, and a considerable amount of skill in persuading both politicians and bureaucrats in a whole range of different settings to take these insights and to take these interventions very seriously. So it seems to me that we should be very positive about the way in which nudge has developed itself over a very short period of time to become a very successful form of policy intervention. But there are concerns about nudge. And these are the concerns that I want to briefly now reflect on with you as well. You can place them under two broad headings. Some of the concerns reflect a kind of range of ethical issues. And the ethical concerns, I think, are partly related to the particular way that Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, in their book Nudge, tried to justify these kinds of interventions. And in particular, they made a kind of general argument for the idea that these interventions which affect and impact on people don't need the consent of those people as long as they're still offered a choice. That is, as long as they could opt out of whatever it is that's offered to them. So, for example, in the case of the letter that you receive from the tax office, it's clearly open to you to simply ignore that letter. That's the argument anyway. I think this is one of the areas where the Thaler and Sunstein argument has run into a whole range of difficulties, and in particular a whole different number of attacks from moral philosophers. And overall, I would say that in football score parlance, it's at least 3-0 to the moral philosophers against Thaler and Sunstein. And quite frankly, if the moral philosophers had taken all their chances, it could have been an even bigger scoreline. So what is it that's the problem? Well, the problem is that it's very difficult to justify a policy unless the intervention is in some ways consented to by the person who's the focus of attention. Now, in different ways, Thaler and Sunstein trying to wriggle out of that concern. So first of all, they argued, well, okay, but as long as the policies are publicly defendable, or as long as they're transparent, then that's good enough. But I think that one person's idea of what is a publicly defendable policy is not necessarily another person's idea of what is a publicly defendable policy. And to be honest, how a default can be transparent, I don't really know, because in some senses, as soon as people knew it was a default, then it wouldn't be working as a default. So there are problems there. The second set of arguments that Thaler and Sunstein put forward was that, well, a lot of these interventions are very easy to get out of, and that's true to a degree, but not if you're not aware that it's actually happening to you. It's difficult to get out of something if you're not sure that you are actually being manipulated. And again, I think the arguments didn't really hold a lot of water. And then they fell back on, I think, an argument which will be very familiar to everyone in this room, which is basically Thaler and Sunstein then went on to an argument which was, well, everyone else does it. That is, I think, an argument which would be familiar to almost everyone who's married in this room, or anyone who has children. It is a standard excuse, which is, no, everyone else is doing it. But the moral philosophers at that point did pretty much as many others would on the other side of that argument and laughed and said, you can't be serious that that's your main argument, that everyone else does it. So I think there are issues about the way in which nudge has been justified, and there are, I think, quite appropriate ethical concerns about what is an ethical nudge and what isn't an ethical nudge, and to what extent you can engage, particularly in deception, when you're putting a nudge into place. But the funny side of this is that although one group of critics kept on saying the danger with nudges, it undermines people's autonomy, another group of critics actually argued much more that it wasn't able to push or shove people hard enough in order to get them to change their behaviour. So there were other criticisms that were made of nudge, that it always just simply achieved short-term changes in people's behaviour, but that it couldn't show, and there was very little evidence to demonstrate, that these little switches in wording would lead to long-term or sustainable changes in behaviour. Other people argued that when it comes to some of the more significant or ingrained behavioural problems that people have, you need much bigger or more substantial ranges of interventions. And still others argued that actually when you look at the practice of nudge, they only cover a relatively partial range of issues. In fact, a lot of nudges are focused not in the way that Thaler and Sunstein imagined, which is doing good to citizens, but more doing good to governments, in that most of the interventions are about compliance, about getting people to obey what the government wants them to do. And again, I think there is some validity and some virtue in each of those different criticisms. There was a third type of criticism, which I'll just mention in case anyone in this audience wants to present the argument, and that is that people developed quite paranoid arguments about how nudge would give the state scientific control over people by enabling them to work out exactly how people thought and then manipulate them fiendishly using behavioural insights. And I think that there is, again, something in that argument, but perhaps not if you push it too far, because the capacity of the state may be enhanced potentially by behavioural insights, but I think there's still, in my opinion, a considerable amount of incompetence left in the state to enable you to still be reasonably confident that they actually aren't that good at manipulating you. But in one particular occasion, when I was having a very tough time from a group of very strong libertarians that were kept on denouncing me as a supporter of nudge, I did come up with a particular riposte, which is, I said in a slightly frustrated way, you should bear in mind that my surname is Stoker, because they kept on saying that Nudge had created a Frankenstein monster. And I said, Stoker invented Dracula, not Frankenstein, and that therefore we can't be held to account for Frankenstein, we can only be held to account for Dracula. My father claimed we were related to Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. He never provided any evidence trail to support that argument, but that was true of many other arguments that he also never provided much of an opinion trail for either. One thing you can say about the manipulative thing is that actually, funnily enough, and Cass Sunstein in some of his more recent work has the survey opinion material to back this up, and in a little bit of work that we did with Jack as well, we showed that actually people don't mind being nudged. That is, they recognise that they might forget things, or they might overlook things, or they might not actually always be tuned in to do the right thing, so they don't mind that much being nudged, provided that the nudge is relatively visible and open and clear for them to see. In a way, it's a bit like receiving a reminder from your computer that you're supposed to be at such and such a meeting 15 minutes ago. Well, that seems to be how my computer works anyway. So you can say that perhaps public opinion actually is a little bit more open to the idea of being nudged than maybe some of the art critics would suggest. So I think I've identified the fact that Nudge has done some good things, but that there are some valid criticisms to be made of Nudge. So let me then suggest that the next stage in the argument should be to say, well, where should we go from here? And I think the first stage in that is to chuck out the arguments that were originally in the Thaler and Sunstein book, because I don't think either of them are necessary for looking at supporting the future of behavioural policy. So those of you that are familiar with the book will know that they use this strange phrase, libertarian paternalism, to justify their particular ethical understanding of what was going on. I think I've already indicated to you that there are substantial problems with that ethical position. And to be honest, it's just plain daft. The truth is that governments are paternalistic. And in fact, you can make a decent argument for being paternalistic. The question is whether you do it in a way that is subject to accountability and subject to democratic oversight. So the issue is not whether you're even manipulating people, because, to be honest, if you don't think a tax is manipulative or you don't think a regulation is manipulative, they're both designed to change your behaviour. In that sense, I think you have to accept that any intervention is to a degree manipulative. So I don't actually think that you need all the paraphernalia of libertarian paternalism and all the problems that I think that created for the arguments for nudge. You do need much more effective arguments about what constitutes an ethical nudge and what is a valuable nudge, and I'll move on to those shortly. But I don't think there's any particular problem in saying that it is paternalistic. It is, but actually almost everything that governments do is paternalistic, and in a democracy we largely justify that by seeing some sort of support or oversight for that intervention from our elected representatives. But the other feature of nudge was that particularly weird period in the 2000s when nudge started to come to the fore, where there was a tremendous emphasis on the virtues of less government, something which Thaler and Sunstein picked up on in their book and presented nudge almost as a kind of standalone policy. You don't need necessarily to worry about regulation. You don't need to worry about taxation. You can just have this new smart form of intervention, a kind of standalone policy. I always thought that argument was rubbish, and I think it is substantially daft as well. So it appears that although I'm agreeing with Laurie that there's no such thing as a daft question, I think there is occasionally daft argument. And if you think about it, the one example I gave early on about the tax form. Now, I don't know what you do when you receive a letter from the tax office. Are you completely relaxed? Do you notice the letterhead on it? And so even behind this alleged quiet little nudge is a letterhead which says Australian Tax Office, or in my case, Her Majesty's Treasury and Customs. And I can assure you that every time you receive an envelope with those initials on the outside, your immediate reaction is not to be overjoyed. I know that in the case of Australia, occasionally it does lead to joy because you get a small rebate, don't you, occasionally? But that never happens in the United Kingdom. But all I'm trying to get at is that behind even that simple nudge is actually quite a substantial policy of tax and regulation. The reason why the letter is read and taken seriously is not just because of the nudge, it's because of the tax and regulation. So there's no need, I think, to present nudge as a stand-alone policy. It isn't a stand-alone policy. It actually relies on its relationship with other policy tools, tax, regulation, and other forms of intervention. Then the next stage in building this argument is to say, well, what we need to do is give nudge a slightly more secure base. And what I have done in the paper with Peter John is make two broad arguments. One is, I think that there's no need to focus very narrowly on the cognitive failures of human beings. You need to focus on both their weaknesses but also their capacity, and we need to develop a slightly less technocratic way of understanding what it is that nudge can do. Now, without going into all the details of the argument in terms of the difference between different cognitive features, are most of you familiar with the broad distinction between the commitment to fast thinking and the commitment to slow thinking? So fast thinking is that intuitive thought process which leads to relatively quick decisions based on only a kind of partial examination of the evidence, etc. And it's what's required a large amount of the time to get through normal life. Now, it is true that there are blunders and biases often in that form of intuitive fast thinking, but actually rarely is it that people are hopeless, and indeed it's an essential tool to survive as a human being to have that capacity for fast thinking. The alternative is the reflective form of slower thinking, which takes place when people are perhaps taking major decisions or reflecting through professional training on issues, or have some longer period of time in order to really both review the construction of their arguments and review the evidence that's available to them. And the broad argument I want to make is that, and these are bits of jargon I want you to be able to take home and use in discussions with friends and family, which is, obviously, if you like, you can accuse somebody of being a cognitive miser. That is not thinking very hard. But if anyone accuses you, just say, oh no, I'm a flexible social thinker. And there's a lot of now evidence that people are actually quite good at swapping between the fast and the slow thinking modes, that they are capable of strategically choosing when they just need to make a quick decision and when they need to spend a little bit more time reflecting on that decision. So, and there are other times, and this is another important issue to bear in mind, there are other times when it's quite sensible to be a cognitive miser. And here's another phrase which you can use in the middle of an argument with people claiming that you haven't really done your research. You can just say, oh no, I'm rationally ignorant. And the argument here is that, you can be rationally ignorant when your chances of influencing the decision are so small that actually there's no point putting the effort into actually finding the necessary evidence and information. And in that circumstance, you can be rationally ignorant. I hope you're going to find these phrases useful in future conversations. But the broad point I'm trying to make is that Thaler and Sunstein in their book rather glorified the stupidities of people. There's a whole chapter which is devoted, and it is funny to read, about the daft ways in which people go about making decisions. And it is true that we can be cognitive misers when it comes to making decisions, but I think they overplayed their hand in relation to that, and that actually, if we revisit the cognitive assumptions that should underlie nudge policy, we can recognise that actually there's much more capacity for thinking, there's much more capacity for reflection, there's actually much more capacity for people to be flexible social thinkers when it comes to behavioural change. And I think the other feature of the way in which both Thaler and Sunstein set up nudge, and nudge has often been operationalised, is it's been operationalised in a very technocratic way. So often a nudge is put together by groups of nudgers sitting around thinking, what could we do to nudge people in a certain area? Perhaps having that discussion with others who are professionals or experts in that area as well, and then coming up with a smart idea and then selling it to a politician to then see if they can actually then implement it. Now, that is a particularly technocratic way of thinking about how to make policy. And there's a very famous political economist, American Charles Lindblom, that has written 3 or 4 books which have been attempting to try and challenge this technocratic understanding of the way that policy should be made. And what he argued for instead is a form of policy making that respected expert knowledge, but also respected craft knowledge, respected knowledge from citizens, and respected knowledge from a whole range of other local sources as well. So that you actually did policy together rather than simply see it as smart people imposing solutions on others. And I think one of the problems with nudge is that it has developed a sense in which it is a smart solution which is imposed on others, whereas I think it should be a smart solution which we develop together. So the future of smart governance is actually self-guiding frameworks that help people and are developed together with people in order to develop more effective behavioural interventions. So now let me move on to the final sets of slides and the punchlines, which is, what do I mean then about the future of nudge, and why do we call it nudge plus? I think it's plus in 3 senses. One is that it's about recognising that nudge is always at its best when it's combined with other tools. That nudge, if you were going to have a behavioural policy that was going to try and get people to eat more healthily, you would perhaps think of smart ways in which you could get them to eat more healthily by presenting healthier options in an easier or more accessible form. But you'd also want to think about taxation. You might also want to think about regulation of the food industry. There are all kinds of other interventions that you'd want to make as well. So you simply wouldn't just rely on nudge as a standalone tool. So nudge plus automatically, I think, commits you to thinking about how nudge can be combined with other tools. Secondly, I think nudge plus for Peter, John and I is about trying to persuade nudgers to do something other than getting people to simply comply with what governments want them to do. Why don't we think of some nudges that would actually help promote people's rights or encourage people to actually achieve or take opportunities themselves? And I think that these are attractive ways in which nudge could be used not so much to get people to pay their taxes, but instead get people to achieve their rights or achieve an advancement in their own life circumstances. Which leads me to the final slide, is that I think part of the real future is to combine nudge with think. I think that nudge is always going to be at its best in the future when it combines itself with recognizing that we are not cognitive misers, that actually most effective nudges require people to think a bit, and we need to build on that insight in order to build nudges that actually encourage people to think and give people the support to think differently and sustain their behavior differently in the long run. So even if we take one of the kind of classic nudges of all time, which is not a public sector nudge, but instead a nudge which I think most of you observed at supermarkets, allegedly, where if you're encouraging a healthy eating policy at the checkout, instead of having sweets and various other goodies, you'd have fresh fruit. Now, according to a pure theory of nudge, all that somebody would do is, oh, there's fresh fruit, I'm going to pick it up, and then put it in their basket. And then you imagine half an hour later, when they've got home, they think, ooh, what's that doing there? It's impossible to imagine that there isn't an element of reflection, even in picking up the fruit. People must have had to think, well, oh yes, I need to eat more healthily. That fruit's going to really happen to help me to do that. So the reality is that actually most nudges do involve a little bit of reflection already, but you can actually build on that to a much greater degree. So a lot of nudges are about helping people to understand their role in the process of change, which even that fruit intervention is an example. But there are other good nudges as well, which use people's intuitive and reflective capacities together. So a very recent nudge which has had some success is a letter from a student already at a relatively good university to people in schools which don't ordinarily think about applying to some of those universities, to encourage those students to get on and apply. And that letter has had some positive effect in encouraging people to apply who ordinarily perhaps wouldn't think that they are the right kind of person to go to that kind of university. But that's just not a pure intuitive nudge, is it? Somebody's got to fill in a form. They've got to fill in an application. They've got to engage in quite a lot of thinking in order to deliver on that nudge. But it's also a nudge which very clearly benefits them and advances their life opportunities. And there's a whole set of other nudges that people have started to talk about, which have got given another smart name, called boosts. And they're all about trying to give people the capacity to make changes to their own lives through capacity building, through training, through giving people the sense of determination and the true grit or the commitment to see something through to the end. So I think that the future of behaviour change is very much to take on board the idea that it is nudge and think that need to be combined, and that it's that combination which will really help. Now, I've decided that my final slide should be a little bit of Shakespeare for you. I'm not going to read it out because I think after the session, if you ask Mark Evans very kindly, he'll bring out his old actor self, and I'm sure he'll do the whole scene for you with blood. But those of you that are Shakespeare scholars will recognise that this is a speech made by Mark Antony, and it's at the funeral of Caesar. And he starts out, of course, by justifying Caesar's assassination, hence those words. But at the remainder of the speech, as it goes forward, he increasingly begins to actually point out that the assassins made a mistake, and eventually he turns the crowd against the assassins. So in a way, I think it's quite appropriate. I want to argue not that you should want to kill nudge, but that you should want to improve it and make it better. And the overall argument that I wanted to put to you is that there's been some unnecessary trappings attached to nudge, and that if we reset its foundations, we can expand its horizons. So we can present a nudge that actually works happily with a range of other tools of intervention, a nudge that actually focuses much more on people's rights and opportunities, and a nudge that actually seriously takes into account people's cognitive capacities instead of thinking it needs to just prey on people's cognitive weaknesses. I think this version of Nudge Plus that we outline in our paper and I've outlined in the talk would provide a way of taking nudge policy forward in the next 10 years. And I hope that in some ways, rather like Mark Anthony, I've convinced you that the assassins were wrong.
Thank you, Gerry. Now, please keep those questions in your mind, and Nick and Jack, I'm sure, will stimulate some other questions. Nicholas.
Thanks, Laurie and Mark. So it's a great opportunity for me to publicly comment on an academic leader and thinker, given that when I leave here, I'm going to go home and mark undergraduate papers, which is going to be quite a different experience. I'd also like to propose a counterfactual to Laurie, which is I call myself an economist, and my chances of getting a Nobel Prize are close to zero. So being an economist is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a Nobel Prize. Necessary but not sufficient. So I got a few reflections from my view of the strengths and weaknesses of nudge and behavioural insights more broadly, and then two comments which I think touch on the omissions or what's missing from the paper, which I think would be useful to think about. So my first reflection is that we have to nudge anyhow. And I guess that's one of the powers of nudges and behavioural insights is we have to design a choice architecture, and we might as well not stuff it up. So I think from an Australian policy community perspective, and thinking about nudges, what we need to start with is not doing bad nudges. And before we get on to changing people's behaviour in a way which we think is in people's best interest, not setting up our policy framework to push people towards things which are not in their best interest. So thinking from the negative perspective, I think is quite useful. The other thing I think we need to reflect on with nudges, and Gerry talked about this a little bit, is we really need to invest in more in knowing what we are nudging people towards and people's views on what is in their own best interests. And in many ways, one of the powers of behavioural insights or nudges is to say that we can help people achieve what they themselves see as being in their own best interests. And that's true, but if we don't actually have a good idea of what people see themselves as being what they want to achieve, then that's very hard to do. And I think that's particularly relevant in the area in which I work, in Indigenous policy, where there is a big push to use nudges, is we don't actually have a very good idea on the aspirations, the goals, the desires of a population group and who have been exposed to quite negative policies in the past. So until we actually know what Indigenous peoples themselves or single parents want to achieve and see in their best interest, it's very hard to apply a nudge. Another thing is from a public policy perspective, I think we need to be very open when nudging doesn't work. And we hear about the success stories, and we very rarely hear about the when things are trialled and they don't actually have any positive impact. So there's two things there. One is we learn as much from null findings, but from a public policy perspective, they never really see the light of day. But also we need to use multiple studies and meta-analyses to see across a range of trials what actually works. And I don't think we do that enough in an Australian policy perspective. Gerry talks a tiny bit about, or doesn't really use these words as much, about the social licence to use these policies, and I think we need to think a lot more about how we can not change people's views about what is desirable from a public policy perspective, but really understanding why people have resistance to certain policy interventions. And I think part of that discussion around social license needs to take into account quite seriously the quite dramatic decline in trust in government. And I think some of the criticisms of nudge are really criticisms of government broadly, and understanding why people are losing trust in government so quickly. I agree that nudges sometimes need to be turned into a push or a shove, but I also think we can learn a lot from behavioural insights about how to push in the least costly way and minimising the unintended consequences. And I think that's actually what some of the more powerful or more useful aspects of behaviour or applications of behavioural insights are. So we know we should make discrimination illegal. It's quite clear, but behavioural insights, nudges, that helps us know why discrimination occurs, when it occurs, how it occurs, and what we need to do about it. So I think the big picture policies, yes, we do need to shove, sometimes we need to push, but behavioural insights helps us know when to do that. I think Gerry touches on it a tiny bit more, probably more in the presentation than in the paper, is there are diminishing returns to nudges. And he talked a little bit about getting a letter from the tax office. And the first time you get that letter, you think, wow, I'm getting a letter from the tax office. Or the first time you get a text message from the tax office, oh shit, the tax office is messaging me. Why they message me? Kind of the 17th time you get a text message from the tax office, you're not actually going to pay too much attention to it. So we can't use the early success of nudges and assume that they're going to continue into the future. The context has changed, but also the extent to which people actually that form of communication is salient has changed. So I guess my broad reflections on the topic in general, and now just my two comments on what I think is missing from the paper. One is that Nudge Plus puts a very strong load on citizens. It puts a big responsibility on citizens, and I think that's a very good thing. And I think actually that's the power of the argument, is to give people autonomy and agency. But I think one of the aspects of behavioural insights which is missing is the effect of complexity, the effect of scarcity on people's ability to make those decisions. And there's no reference in the paper to the work of Mullainathan and Shafir, which talks about the way in which complex lives and poverty diminishes people's ability to make those decisions. And I think reflecting a little bit on what circumstances make it easier for people to engage in that plus part and the circumstances we need to, or what we need to do to make to give people the opportunity to be able to use that slow thinking. And the other thing which I think is missing, and this is certainly not a criticism, but it's a reflection on the Australian context, is that data matters. And all the insights we get from nudges, from behavioural insights, come from a rigorous either field trials or lab trials to a certain extent, and we just don't have the data infrastructure in Australia to be able to do that and do that in an effective way and do that in an ethical way. So the trials, which Gerry has advocated many times before, trials aren't expensive. Data collection is expensive. So if we want a nudge plus in Australia, we need to trial interventions in an Australian context. And to trial interventions in an Australian context, we need access to good administrative, survey and linked data to be able to make decisions as to this is working and this isn't working. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Jack.
Thank you. So I'll start with a disclaimer, and I think that's, sorry, I think we have too many microphones. I think that's important. I used to be the National General Manager for Government at Telstra. I've changed roles. I now have an even fancier title as Head of Global Foresight. But I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here probably more as an adjunct with the Institute for Governance than in my day role, and I'll explain to you why that in a second. But I can't help notice that we went from a Centenary professor to an associate professor, and you only have an adjunct in front of you, so not a real professor. So my interest in behavioral insights stems from my research. I've got a PhD in what I usually tell people, cognitive science in advertising. So I studied the process of decision making and how the brain decides whether something's relevant or boring, and I applied it in advertising. And one of the things that I did as part of that research was to study a broad range of disciplines where influencing decision-making was very important. And most of those disciplines were in advertising research, consumer studies, and the like. So when the first economist or the first psychologist and economist got his Nobel Prize for behavioral insights, which was Kahneman in 2004, I used to go around and say to people who would ask me, so what did you study? I would say, you know, Kahneman, I'm a very, very boring version of that. And that kind of got people at least on the line. So I'm here because I have an interest in kind of, you know, by way of research and by way of my background in behavioral insights, and I'm not here to represent Telstra in any way, shape, or form. So, so with that kind of out of the way, I'll say that kind of to steal a famous cinematic line and transform it, I see nudges everywhere. And I'm saying that because it's true. If I reflect on my niece, she's almost 2 years old, right? And as many kids or babies of that generation, she's so used to a tablet, right? And to the swiping action, that she would try to swipe her TV, the paper magazines, pretty much everything. And if you take a step back and think about that, you think about the choice architecture that the parents or the school or the childcare or the broader environment created for that child, the default settings that that kid is used to most of the time, and realize that actually we are nudging, we are influencing behavior, we are influencing the decision making and the choice of default, right? So nudge is, if you look at the world in that way, nudge is very much everywhere. And sure, we can start talking about from a more scientific or research point of view about the cognitive biases, the heuristics about it, but nudge is a part of everyone and everyday's life, right? More importantly, as a society, I make the point that we are applying nudges, and we have been doing so for a long period of time, and those nudges or those influences have significantly changed our behavior, not only at an individual level, but at a society level as well. So if I'm thinking about, when I used to to study advertising, the effect of round prices, the $19.99 or the $199 instead of $200, that's been known and it's been tested for decades, for many decades, to the point that now we actually take it for granted and we just walk into a shop, and that still kind of works today as well as it worked a number of years ago. But moreover, more than that, we actually now, there is a whole body of new research talking about the charm of rounded prices. So it is so ingrained to us that in itself has a different effect in terms of setting the defaults. That's going on for, as I said, 5-6 decades. If we think more recent, right, in the last decade or so, think about the new technology of social media and how that has such a significant impact on the content of visual, audio, video, and written content that gets produced, right? Things get shorter, get sharper, get louder, get glitzier, and that's because there is an entire ecosystem, an entire technology stack, an entire world out there that relies on that recipe in order to get attention. And while it relies on that recipe in order to get attention, it is that particular content, that particular format of content that will get attention. So it is self-reinforcing. And this, we see the emergence of a whole new set of implications for us as a society and for our political elected politicians, for the policy making and for the broader issues that we have to deal with. And that is because essentially we're talking about more or less the impact of reduced cognitive effort. So, think about the driving on autopilot in a positive sense, but also the reduced deliberative and evaluative processes that come with that and makes us kind of ignore some of that flexible social thinking part just because it is easy. It is easy for us to do so. Now, private sector, ignoring Telstra, private sector in general has also the great opportunity to track this and to use data, to pick up on Nick's point, to use data to continually refine what they're doing and how they're applying those nudges. In the marketing world, for example, in retail, to pick just one industry, the conversation has moved from how do we make sure that the customers are happy to how do we personalize marketing at the level of an individual. And not only at the level of an individual, so not only how we target Jack so that he can buy his next apparently academic jacket, but also how we target Jack when he is walking through David Jones. To make sure that he buys the jacket from David Jones. So we're talking about personalized space and time marketing. And these things, get continually refined because the data is there in the private sector to be able to do so. So while on the public sector side, we are somewhat at pains to make sure that we have the social license to do something, that we are inclusive, that we don't discriminate, that we consider all possible options and combine different policy tools. At the same time, the private sector, who's been doing this for years and years and years, continues to evolve and innovate and move at a much faster speed. So, do I support the proposition put forward by Gerry? I do. Because if I turn my mind to the public sector side, there are a number of conversations that are moving towards this idea of user-driven public sector, of user-driven government, and of user-driven policy making. For a while, and I think for the last 10 years or so at least, that's been quite in vogue to talk about user-centric or citizen-centric government, whereas now, whether we're talking about open data, or whether we're talking about policy interventions, or whether we're talking about, and that's next week, the feedback from the public, it is that they want to get more involved in the policy making and essentially the decision-making process. So from that point of view, I'm fully supportive of that. I think the only thing I would suggest is that, much like the private sector, we take the theory and we actually put it into practice and we continue to refine it, right? Let's use the scientific method. We have a hypothesis how this is going to work in conjunction with multiple tools. Let's try it. Let's see if it makes it work, and let's go forward with it. And I'm pretty much going to finish here. The only other point I had was about the support side, generally speaking, from the Australian public for nudges. And Gerry alluded to the fact that at IGPA, Telstra, we did a piece of work around that. But I'll keep you in suspense. If you really want to know what the results of those are, you have to come back on Monday. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Now, I am conscious of time, but we're very happy to take questions, and if you like to formulate your questions that may give Gerry an opportunity of responding to the comments by Nicholas and Jack, that would be wonderful. But at the moment, we're open for questions. Yes.
Thank you. Fascinating. So my question is, we accept that we get nudges, and my own, personal experience is now I don't bother taking the initiative. I wait for the nudge. So I know that I haven't updated my credit card with my mobile phone provider, so they're going to try and debit my credit card and it's not going to work, and they're going to send me a text message saying, we've tried to debit your credit card and it didn't work, and I go, oh God, that's right, I better BPay it, so I BPay it, and then the same thing happens again next month and next month and next month. So we're building a culture of people who don't take initiative anymore, or who don't take responsibility for their actions because they know someone's going to give them a nudge. Is that a risk that you see from this philosophy?
Open to everyone.
Just my very brief response would be that you're being too hard on yourself. That in my jargon, you're being a strategic social thinker. That's basically you're saying in these circumstances, I don't need to do the effort. I don't need to do the reflection because it's actually going to be done for me and I'll get the reminder when I need it and I'm still in control. And in that sense, I think relying on simply a reactive response is entirely appropriate. So I think if you did that in all aspects of your life, that would be a problem. But one of the big advantages of some of the changes in technology and potentially further changes to come is it actually might free up people to engage on more substantial reflection on some of those issues that they might need to engage more substantially in that mode. So I think almost everyone swaps between, I'll just wait until something goes wrong, or I'm going to really be strong about this and do something about it ahead of time. But if you did that, that is, you were active in every single moment of your life, you would really be hell to live with. I think the good balance is the right thing.
So just one thing to add to that. I think people in this audience probably have more freedom to be able to relax and allow the nudges to push them in the right direction. Those who we are concerned most about in public policy don't have that freedom. And if you don't pay your credit card, then you'll get a reminder because the credit card company kind of cares about your custom. Those who don't pay a fine and then lose their license and then can't kind of engage in the rest of society, that's who we need to be worried about. And I think the extent to which the lives of those individuals aren't made as easy as it should be is one area where I think nudges could be improved. But also the extent to which the lives of those people or people in those circumstances are pushed around more than they should be are the areas we need to be concerned about. So I think there's a heterogeneity across the population in terms of where nudges can and can't be useful and where they can and can't be have that negative effect which you're talking about.
I would, from my side, I would say that you're probably a marketer's dream. And the reason I say that is because if you think about, let's extrapolate from the concept of a reminder. A reminder in and of itself is not necessarily a nudge. However, if you're relying on a signal from a particular, supplier, let's call it, or a particular vendor, right? If you're relying on a signal from a particular vendor in order to act, and you're essentially acting because you got that signal, then you are indeed a marketer's dream. Because if I send you instead of sending you a reminder to pay your credit card, if I send you an offer to increase your credit card limit once, twice, 3 times a year, you may end up with a huge balance, and you may end up in debt for the rest of your life. But I'll also pick up on something that Nick mentioned, which was both now, and I think he also alluded to it in his presentation, on the cognitive loading effect of poverty. And the work that you mentioned has been some kind of groundbreaking work in showing that people that actually deal with severe poverty, that has a very limiting effect on their cognitive abilities to consider pretty much anything outside of their kind of subsistence or being able to make it from day to day. And that is a category or a segment of the population significantly at risk in that they are likely to feel, generally speaking, cognitively overloaded and overwhelmed, and they are likely to fall for nudges. Hence the point that I think it's very valid and very well worth remembering that we have to make sure that first and foremost we avoid the negative effects of nudges, or the negative nudges, as opposed to how do we carefully tune the positive ones.
Okay, look, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to the presenter and the responses to the presentation. I found them really interesting. But having said that, I want to go back to an earlier point that was made that there's no such thing as a silly question. And I feel like I'm going to ask one which might go down that path. I've come here because I'm a member of the U3A, and I got something in the email which talked about this, and I have a fair interest in democracy and politics, and I thought that this might be heading down that path. Having been here and listened to you, I almost feel that nudging, which I know nothing about, I almost feel it's a movement, sort of like Get Up, or just a way of thinking. I just hope you might be able to explain in a really brief way what nudging is to those of us who might not know the background to it.
Okay. I think this is a very reasonable request, and the problem is that it's probably one of the most ill-defined concepts in the social sciences, and that's because the people who popularised it as a kind of way of talking about behavioural change policy used nudge to catch a whole family of different kinds of behavioural interventions, which are some ways connected to one another, but not always. But they thought that nudge was a good selling name because it sounds like the kind of thing that governments would do if they were engaged in soft intervention. So I think that they were using marketing tricks to sell the basic idea. So what is the heart of nudge? I think it is a set of insights that derive from careful studies about the way in which people make decisions, which shows, and I'm sure you'll be shocked and amazed to hear, that people are not fully comprehensive, rational thinkers when it comes to making almost all of their decisions, and they engage in a variety of shortcuts or the use of different heuristics or the different ways in which they take messages from others in order to decide what to do. So I think that nudge is about taking that body of knowledge, which is about the way that people actually really understand the choices in front of them and the way in which they make decisions, and beginning to apply that to public policy. So instead of trying to change somebody's behaviour by writing them a 15-page essay on how they should change their behaviour, what it tries to do is think, well, what could we do that actually fits in with the way in which they make choices, the way in which they make decisions, that they'll pay attention to, that actually will have some impact on their behaviour. So I think that the term nudge is then used to capture literally 20 or 30 different types of intervention, but they're all built on this fundamental insight that people are not fully rational decision makers, that they make their choices in a way which is affected by the environment around them, so that if we as government or as public policy makers could condition that environment in a different way, we might help them make better choices. Does that help a little bit? I should have said that at the beginning, really, shouldn't I?
Thank you. Well, it seems to me that from a government perspective, the alternative to using a nudge is compulsion. And for example, in Australia, we have compulsory superannuation, which disadvantages low-income earners who end up paying tax on which they wouldn't pay if they weren't compelled to contribute to superannuation. So the use of a nudge in which allowed you to opt out, it seems to me would be a more open, liberal response than compulsion. So while there may be ethical issues in relation to nudging, I think you need to think about the ethical issues in response to what the alternatives might be as well.
Yeah, I think my main response to that is that's a very fair point, and I agree. I think that the discussion then becomes about what kind of intervention you think is justifiable, The problem came more in the way that the original argument was set up by Thaler and Sunstein, which kind of seemed to attempt to bypass that judgment by arguing that if they allowed choice, then there wasn't even worth having a conversation about whether the intervention was justified or not. So I agree with your point, and it I think is illustrative of just how daft the argument went down a particular route, which led to, I think, some of the criticisms of the ethical problems around nudge.
My question follows on from the questioner before last, I think. It strikes me that fake news is a very blunt form of nudging. How do you protect the populace, me in particular, from falling for fake news rather than an overt nudge?
Well, obviously my answer is going to be, it must be Jack's presentation on Monday.
I'm happy to take that question. I don't think anyone is going to protect or should aim to protect everyone else from fake news. Because if you think about it, who decides what's fake and what isn't? Apart from, so if you take information and you look at information as being either factual or opinion, and you kind of have those two separate categories. Factual information can be checked, verified, and so on, right? You have dictionaries, you have definitions, you have bodies of knowledge, and so on. Opinion information, which is where a significant amount of the fake news started from, it's much more difficult to police. And the reason for doing that is because we all live in our own bubbles, right? And the new kind of internet world promotes those bubbles. So we tend to find comfort in associating with people like us, with people that have similar opinion with us, with other. We look for sameness, or at least resemblance of what our world looks like. And that's because from a cognitive point of view, it's very taxing to always argue with someone that you are right and they are wrong, right? So you tend to avoid people that you don't agree with, and you tend to associate with people or with news or with information that you agree with. And that has a bit of a self-fueling effect. Now, what happens through technology is that now, today, there is the opportunity to take fake information or opinion, package it, and distill it to a degree that it becomes essentially fake news for people which are outside of that world, but probably is considered to be absolutely the gospel for people living within that bubble. Trying to, first of all, identify all those bubbles, identify all the fake news, it's pretty much an impossible situation because this is an evolving situation, one. And two, I remember 1984 by George Orwell and the double thing and all that. And I don't think that I actually, with all the significant issues that are currently happening in that space, I don't think I want one body, one authority to say what's right and what's wrong.
Given the pace of modernity, but particularly the amount of information we're increasingly subjected to process every day, do you believe there's a propensity for rational thinking to be the less dominant form of response to a decision, and for us to become effectively over-nudged?
I think the difficulty I've got is that, if you even think about the issue of fake news, it's not as if that is new. I came out to Australia only about a couple of weeks ago in the build-up to Bonfire Night, which is on November the 5th in the UK, which allegedly celebrates the breaking of the gunpowder plot. And there was a very dramatic kind of 3-episode TV thing put on about it. But what was absolutely crystal clear was that even in that time period, there was a lot of fake news around and a lot of spectacular misinformation. I think that we live in both the best of times and the worst of times. I think it's the worst of times in terms of the amount of information, but it's the best of times in terms of access to, if you're prepared to go and search for it, alternative sources of information and alternative ideas. So in that sense, I think that we just need to develop, and I think there's lots of evidence that particularly amongst younger generations it's already happening, that capacity to sift those sources quite effectively and access those that actually give you better information. So I would say that marginally I'm a glass is half full in relation to this argument.
If I can add to that, I'm going to disagree with Gerry on one count, which is that it is the worst of times for with the amount of information we're dealing with. That may be the case today, but it's definitely not going to be the case tomorrow. The statistics widely quoted in the information world is that 90% of all the world's information has been created in the last 2 years. And we are on an exponential curve. But however, only about 0.1% of that actually is analyzed or looked at in any way, shape or form.
You're talking about my articles there, right?
Indeed, definitely. So I think I agree that there is a lot of noise, and our ability to sift through the noise is a critical ability going forward. And I think we see that that conversation emerging both in terms of how the future of work is being defined as the new ways and new skills and new faculties and new capabilities that people will require, the way that the education system is changing, the way that we're going to start interacting with other forms of information processing like automated, machine learning and all that sort of stuff. But so that's the point I wanted to make on that one.
Last question.
Right, thanks very much for those presentations. I work in the area of Indigenous health. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the contributions that Nicholas Biddle has made in his writings about what we know and what we don't know about behavioural insights and Indigenous populations, so thank you for that. I'd actually like to pick up on something that you said in your response, and I'm really struggling with this. It's the notion of talking to people to find out more about what they believe is in their own best interest. Now, I think we know that people have been shown to be not particularly good and reliable judges of this. Part of the reason is that immediate gratification tends to take over. I think in terms of Indigenous populations, there may be a special case because quite a lot has been done in the name of that group rather than really consulting with them. So I would acknowledge definitely that there's more qualitative research that needs to be done there. But generally speaking, we hear all the time that people say, I wished I hadn't started smoking. I wish I hadn't eaten so much junk food last night. I wish I'd stayed in school and got some qualifications. So is there a justifiable need to save people from their former selves? And is that a legitimate justification for nudges?
Well, thanks for that question.
I guess my point was not that individuals are the best judges always of achieving their own self-interest, and I guess that's the fundamental argument of nudge is that you help people set up an environment, an architecture where people can achieve what is they themselves sees in their own best interest. So it's not that people will necessarily not smoke or not drink, or not there's anything wrong with drinking, we've got alcohol around us, but that you take the time to learn what individuals or groups of individuals would want to achieve, and then you set up an environment which helps them achieve that. And I think why one of the examples which Gerry gave around savings was so powerful is that survey after survey said that people wanted to save more for their retirement. that they stated that as in their own best interest, this is what they want to achieve. And then they weren't doing so. And what helped is, rather than people having to opt into a savings account, people were automatically enrolled and then had to opt out. So it's not that people will automatically achieve it, but that we set things up to help people do what they themselves would want to do. So it's about learning from people what the ends are, what their own ends are, and then helping to set up the means for them to achieve it. And what I think is problematic from that argument is that we don't actually know what people's ends are in all circumstances. We know that certain individuals want to save more for their retirement. I think the example I gave before was that in other circumstances, people might want to spend more now because that's in their own best interest. So taking the time to understand what those ends are, and then using science and research and trials to help people achieve those.
Other comments?
When I was little, I wanted to be a fireman. And I'm saying that because as a very simplistic way of illustrating that most people at most times don't actually have, one, a full reflection of what they want to achieve into the future, two, perfect information in order to enable them to make that decision, and three, more importantly, a clear understanding of the impact of the choices they make today, tomorrow, and the path to get into the future. I think your question can be taken either at a very pragmatic level, in which case the answer may be in most circumstances, or in many circumstances there may be a role for an intervention. It can be taken at a philosophical level, and then you start talking about free will and the ability of people to be self-deterministic and so on. And I'm not quite sure where you're trying to direct the conversation, but I think that given the pragmatic side of the fact that many people don't have information about what they want to achieve, they're not skilled, they don't have an understanding of the impact of the choices they make and so on, that may be a reason to say, well, at least if you don't know these are the choices that are available, and this is the impact of those choices, and we recommend the following, which is essentially what a nudge should be.
Last word to Gerry.
Very quickly, I do want to definitely concede the argument that both Nick and Jack to an extent made, which is that if I'm making my broader argument for allowing nudge to kind of step into a world where you exploit the wider cognitive capabilities of people, that issues of inequality in terms of the circumstances that enable people to exercise those capabilities, I think is a reasonable challenge. But the final thing I wanted to say is I'm afraid I'm very hard line on people knowing their own best interests ultimately. The alternative is somebody else telling them what their best interests are. And throughout the history of humanity, that's not worked out so well. And you can tell how strongly committed I am to this principle, in that I think I mentioned before that I come from the United Kingdom. As far as I'm concerned, my fellow citizens made a pathologically stupid decision to leave the European Union. And yet so committed I am to the idea that they had the right to make that decision, that at the moment I'm not committed to removing the vote from all of those that I'm reserving that position. But the truth is that I think the best principles in public policy are ones that build on recognizing that people are capable of guiding themselves towards their best interests. They might need support, they might need encouragement, they might need additional capacity in order to do that. But ultimately, I think that individuals are the best guide to their own best interests, and it's beholden to public policy to work with that rather than try and impose solutions, no matter how expert you are, no matter how kindly you are disposed towards those people, the reality is people need to be their own deciders.
Please join with me in thanking all of our speakers.